Good evening. Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to have you here tonight. Friends and people who we've not met before. It's a full house, so welcome. I am Louise Lenahan, the interim provost of the CUNY Graduate Center, and I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's event. We are delighted to host William Deresiewicz, author of the much-discussed book, Excellent Sheep, The Miseducation of the American Elite, and a Way to a Meaningful Life, or maybe not. He will speak with the Graduate Center's own Morris Dickstein, well known to many of you as a literary critic and a cultural historian. As you may be aware, the CUNY Graduate Center is a school of arts and sciences, a center for applied and theoretical research, and a platform for performance, conversation, and public debate. A community of scholars, students committed to the idea that learning is a public good. We regularly offer public programs featuring eminent thinkers, cultural leaders, distinguished artists, and others addressing some of today's most pressing issues. Tonight, we look at one such issue, the very nature of the and purpose of higher education in our society. The questions raised by Bill Deresiewicz' book and his essay, The Disadvantages of an Elite Education, viewed over 1 million times online, are close to the mission and the spirit of this public institution. Here are some of the issues. Does the Ivy League turn eager students into high-achieving professionals dedicated to success, but without a moral compass? Has this system manufactured a class of leaders focused only on self-gain rather than serving the public as a whole? If so, how can students develop a sense of meaning and purpose rather than becoming excellent sheep? Bill is a contributor to the American Scholar, the New Republic, and the Nation. His testament to the transformative power of literature, a Jane Austen education, How 6 Novels Taught Me About Love, Friendship, and the Things That Really Matter, was published in 2011. Bill holds a PhD in English from Columbia and taught at Yale from 1998 to 2008. As you may have seen, he recently sparred with Stephen Colbert on the Colbert Report. Morris Dickstein, a distinguished professor of English and theater at the Graduate Center, is the author of Dancing in the Dark, A Cultural History of the Great Depression, Leopards in the Temple, The Transformation of American Fiction, 1945 to 1970, Gates of Eden, American Culture in the 60s, among many other books. A former editor of the Partisan Review, he has published numerous essays and reviews in the New York Times Book Review, the New Republic, the Nation, Times Literary Supplement, and other periodicals. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests for this evening.
Yes? Okay, great. I'm really delighted to see you all and delighted to be here as part of this conversation. My role in the conversation will be I'll tell you a story. My daughter, who works in theater, when she was a student, she directed a really frightening play by Samuel Beckett called Not I, and Not I has only 2 characters. One of them is a mouth that is speaking repeatedly throughout the play, and the other is called the silent auditor. I will be the relatively silent auditor as Bill presents his fascinating and very timely and important book. I just want to say a few things. I'm not going to try to describe his book because I'm going to have him do that. But just to say a few words about the kind of book it is. Every once in a while, a book sort of like hits the audience in a particular way and becomes a book that everyone talks about and everyone reads and everyone cites and everyone argues with and everyone attacks. You know, in the 40s it was the Kinsey Report. In the 50s it was the Lonely Crowd or the Organization Man, which added terms to the language, terms like inner-directed and other-directed and so on. In the 70s and 80s, it was books like Christopher Lash's The Culture of Narcissism and Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. And these books just became benchmarks for a conversation that had been very scattered until then and enabled people to sort of focus that conversation. I think the thing about Bill's book that really struck me, first of all, is the writing, which is very sharp, aphoristic, focused, and very brilliant, I think, and very angry. It's a very angry book. You wouldn't know from looking at him what a furious guy he is. At one point in the book, he even talks about reading a book on his subject and barely withstanding the desire to retch, you know. I don't think he'll do that tonight, but I think the important thing about it is that the number of often separately discussed issues that he brings together and in connection with each other. One of them, obviously, is the role of higher education in America today, the kind of students it attracts, the role the kind of students that it actually turns out, and the kinds of universities and colleges that we have in America and the differing roles that they have. Another, you know, that's been discussed separately very differently is the nature of parenting, how parents are preparing kids for their college applications from the time they're in pre-K. And this is a rather important part of the subject. The other thing that surprised me that when I read the book, though I'd read a number of things about it, was just the level of social criticism in the book, almost a kind of utopian sense of what kind of society we ought to have compared to the kind of society that we do have. And this I think is really, you know, some of the, I mean, this kind of book, just to throw in a tangent, this kind of book really originated in Victorian England. In Victorian England, of course, there were huge social and cultural changes, and this gave rise to a particular kind of book or essay that used to be called the Condition of England question. What was the condition of England? The country was taking its temperature, and I think Bill's book is not simply about education, but it's really a kind of it's on the condition of America question. Where are we today compared to where we were 50 years ago and 100 years ago? And finally, it's a book about the nature of the humanities and the role of a liberal education, something that has been eroded gradually, I think largely because of the changing economics in American life. And I think I'm sure he'll have something to say about this. But right now, I would like to turn it over to him to give us, many of you have read the book and some of you have not, and I'd like him to give us a sense of what he's trying to do here.
Thanks, Morris, and for everybody for coming, and the Grad Center for hosting us. You can hear me? Okay. Those were just the perfunctory thank yous. I don't need to repeat those, as heartfelt as they were. Actually, here's a really heartfelt thank you. Thank you for noticing that the book is about something more than either just parenting, which is what parents tend to notice, or an assault on the Ivy League, which is what the, quite frankly, very defensive, reactively hostile reaction I've gotten from people who are identified or over-identified with their own Ivy League credentials have been giving me, and noticing that the book is about a lot of other things as well. You started by saying that the book is a book that's much discussed and much read. I'm actually worried that it's one of these books that's so much discussed that it's not that much read. I mean, I'd never felt the need to read Sheryl Sandberg's book because I already knew what she was saying. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. They're books like this. So if people actually read it, that would be even better. Especially if, as I think is often the case, and maybe the case with many of you here, what you mainly know about the book, you know because of the excerpt that was published in the New Republic about a month before the book came out. I do want to say about that excerpt, which was actually presented as a standalone essay and was in fact an excerpt. It was actually a collage of very short excerpts assembled by the magazine without much input from me. Every word is mine. I think I would have presented it a little differently. Also, then they put this title on, Don't Send Your Kids to the Ivy League, which people have really seized on as if that's what I'm saying in the book, as if that I was only talking about the Ivy League, if that's all I was saying, if that's even really what I was saying, even a little bit, because it's terribly oversimplified. And then they also had that graphic of the Harvard flag burning. I'm not sure if that was photoshopped or if they actually took a Harvard flag out to the parking lot of the New Republic building and set it on fire. I don't know. So look, it got people's attention in a very big way, and that was great, but at the cost of somewhat distorting my message, if only by cutting out a lot of what I had to say. So I think the best way to explain the rest of what I had to say is by going back and talking about how the book came about. I think you mentioned that 6 years ago I published, the person who introduced us mentioned that 6 years ago I published an essay in the American Scholar called The Disadvantages of an Elite Education. If I had known that people would read it, I would have given it a better title. It's a very clumsy title. It was actually rejected by a much more prominent publication. The editor said, you know, I like this except that it's poorly written, poorly structured, and I want you to change the ending. And then the American Scholar was nice enough to publish it. But it was the American Scholar, which is a great little literary quarterly whose readership soars into the 4 figures. And I figured nobody would read it. What I didn't realize, although I should have by 2008, is that things don't get published in the American Scholar anymore. They don't get published in the New Republic. They get published, everything gets published in one place. It gets published on the internet. And by day 3, it was literally day 3, the piece, as they say, went viral. It very quickly got about 100,000 readers on its way 6 years later to over 1 million. But I think it was interesting the way it got to 1 million because, like I said, there was an initial surge, but mainly it just kept getting read at the rate of a few thousand a month for year after year after year. And I have a good reason to think that most of the people who were reading it were students at selective colleges or recent graduates of selective colleges, or eventually, I think, because of high school teachers, juniors and seniors at the kinds of high schools that send a lot of kids to selective colleges. So it's basically circulated for all these years as a kind of samizdat, underground literature among that demographic. And the reason that I think that's true is that I also immediately started to get emails, ultimately hundreds of emails from readers, and almost all of them were from that demographic. And almost all of those said some version of, thank you for putting this into words. Thank you for putting my experience into words. I've also felt that something is missing from my education, that I am being controlled by values that I didn't choose but don't know how to get out of. Thank you for putting it into words, or thank you for saying in public what I've been saying to myself, or what I've been saying to my best friend at Cornell, Northwestern, Stanford, Harvard. I think what I realized was that I had tapped into a hunger or a discontent that that I didn't know was out there, quite frankly. I thought this was just me. I thought this was just, and it wasn't. And that's when I realized that maybe I needed to keep talking about this. Maybe I needed to think about writing a book eventually. Another thing that happened in the same vein was that students started to invite me, sometimes students and sometimes faculty members, but often students started to invite me to speak on their campuses. The first one actually was at Harvard. It was a few months after the article came out in the fall of 2008. And these events assumed a certain predictable pattern, which was that however big the room was, there were never enough seats. However long the discussion was supposed to go, it never went long enough. People wanted to talk to me afterwards. People wanted to follow me out to the car to keep talking about this. Because they really needed to talk about this. They really needed to talk about, what is my education about? What is my life supposed to be for? What's the connection between those two things? There's this beautiful thing that a young woman at Stanford said when I was there in the spring. She said, what are the hidden incentives around us that are shaping the way we dream? I actually wrote that down on a piece of paper and kept it on my desk for a while. That's what they care. That's what they want to talk about. That's what's missing for them. And the most characteristic question that I would be asked, either by email or at one of these events, was some form of, what can we do about it? Or what am I supposed to do about it? What can we as a society do about it? What's your ideal college? What does your ideal college education look like? And that's really what the second half of the book became. It's actually, strictly speaking, the middle half of the book. It's parts 2 and 3. And it's the part that really got very underrepresented in the excerpt that the New Republic put together. That positive, constructive vision of what college should be for and what college should look like and what goals students should have for going to college. And I think the best way of giving you a shorthand for what that is actually to quote David Brooks. Maybe you noticed that Steven Pinker, the Harvard pseudoscientist, wrote a response to the New Republic piece. Like many people, he responded only to the excerpt without bothering to have read the book, where he said, this guy is, he's fixated on this bohemian notion of authenticity, and he talks about building a self. He says, I may be symptomatic of everything that's wrong with higher education today, but I don't know how to help students build a self. And when we hire faculty members in my department, we don't ask ourselves whether they are going to be good at helping students build a self. And I thought, he's right. He is symptomatic of everything that's wrong with higher education. For many other reasons as well. And David Brooks wrote a column that responded to me and to Pinker's response to me, and I think he said it more succinctly than I did in the book, which is that traditionally, and it's important to emphasize that traditionally, this is not something that only existed in the 60s for the hippies, and not something that only existed in the 19th century for the aristocrats, but traditionally in America, and we can talk more about this if you want to ask or comment. Traditionally in American higher education, we've understood college to serve 3 goals, not necessarily completely distinct goals. There's the vocational goal. That's what everybody else is thinking about. Return on investment. How's this going to help me get a job anyway? You must be kidding me. You want me to major in English. The vocational goal. Pinker's goal, which Brooks called the cognitive goal, basically learning stuff. Learning subject content or better, the intellectual skills that go along with some particular subject area. And then the third goal, Brooks, I think, called the moral. That's not a word that works too well for me. People traditionally would also talk about character education. Also doesn't work so well for me. But I think we all understand what that means. It means that other thing. That thing that responds to you not as a future professional or a future specialist or a future scholar, but as what they used to call the whole man or the whole person. It's the reason that we, uniquely in this country, have electives. We have majors, and then we have electives. We're the only country that does that. If you study chemistry somewhere else, that's all you study. But we have this idea that we're giving our students a liberal arts or a liberal education, which isn't even so much about studying humanities or something else. It's about studying broadly across the fields for the sake of building a self, a soul, a self, for the sake of becoming an adult. Once upon a time, it was actually understood to be for the sake of creating citizens who can participate in that very rare thing in human history, collective self-government. That's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm trying to remind people about. And one of the most dismaying things to me about the response to the excerpt, to the book, has been that if, let's say in shorthand again, that I've been saying that the Ivy League and other elite institutions don't do a very good job of giving students a real education, by which I mean that thing, much of the response, including or especially from within the Ivy League, has been not, you're wrong, we do, but who wants a real education anyway? Don't be a sucker. You know, what are you going to major in English? You know. One of the two pieces that the New Yorker ran responding to this, to me, both of which basically said that, as far as I'm concerned. One of them, the one by Joshua Rothman, which was the online one that responded to the excerpt over the summer, he said that I'm really talking about modernity. And I'm really talking about the accelerations of modernity, and what I don't realize is that, you know, we can't do anything about it. I think he's precisely wrong, but he's wrong in a way that helped me frame better the larger picture, the picture that belongs to a larger social critique. It's true that modernity, as it's been represented in literature and in history and elsewhere, has been about increasing acceleration. But there's also something that might be called modern youth, which also dates from the beginning of what we call modernity, late 18th century, French Revolution, the Romantics, Wordsworth, Rousseau, Goethe. And modern youth is not about acceleration. Youth it wasn't felt necessary to force youth to participate in that acceleration of adult life. Youth did something else in modernity. Youth stood outside society and questioned it. It was the privilege, and indeed the duty of youth, to melt the world down in thought and seek to reforge it anew. There was a kind of revolutionary obligation. This did not begin and end in the 60s. I would say it ended in the 60s, substantially. Insofar as college is about being young, which it is for a traditional 18 to 22-year-old student, that's part of what it's been about. And college was also seen as a time to do those things. What I'm talking about, he made me realize, is not modernity, but postmodernity, by which I simply mean, you talked about changes in our economic situation. I don't see this as being about changes in our economic situation. I see this as being about changes in our economic ideology or our social ideology, which we can call Reaganism or neoliberalism or economism or market fundamentalism or any name you want to give to the fact that over the last about 40 years, I was a senior in high school when Ronald Reagan was elected, so I'm just old enough to have seen the whole arc. We have reached a point where we seem to believe that the only things that matter about being human are our functions as producers and consumers in the marketplace, or as Wordsworth put it, getting and spending. And with that reorientation of our whole attitude towards everything, towards ourselves, towards human life, as Kurt Vonnegut put it, towards what people are for, has come a reorientation to our attitude about youth. And now youth is not about standing outside before you plunge into adulthood and beginning to think about a different world that you might want to help work towards, but beginning to accelerate so that when you hit adulthood, the day you graduate from college, you're already up to speed. And as you alluded to, that acceleration actually doesn't happen in college, doesn't begin in college, it begins in nursery school. This is what we've turned youth into. This is, I'm sorry, this is what we've turned childhood into. So now we have a neoliberal childhood. I'll just say one more thing. One of the other things that I've learned since the book came out as a result of the response to the book, and now the response is not just from the underground of college students, but everyone who has a stake in the game, parents, high school teachers, employers, older alumni. It's often interesting to hear people who went through college in the 50s and 60s, because it was different then. Their response, what I've learned from it could be summarized like this. I wrote a book about elite higher education in America. And what I've learned is that it's not about elite higher education only, it's not about higher education only, and it's not about America only. This is what education has become or is becoming throughout the world at every level. And the other thing I've learned is that a lot of people are pissed off about it, and a lot of people are trying to do things about it. This afternoon, I had the pleasure of meeting, I think he's in the audience somewhere, someone involved in the Montessori movement, specifically the Jewish Montessori movement. And I hear from people who are starting high schools or have started high schools or want to raise their kid in a different way or want to go through life in a different way. I hope this book becomes a rallying point for those energies, but whether it does or not, I'm glad that those energies are out there. I hope they're gathering force. I hope that a generation from now we can look back and say, we saw that we had taken a wrong turn and we made a course correction. I don't know if that's going to happen or not.
There's a really interesting historical perspective in your book, and maybe we can step back and look at how we came to this situation, what preceded it. You and I have a lot of shared educational experiences a couple of decades apart, and you talk about, I think you essentially describe three periods in the book. One is the old kind of hot, I mean, for better or worse, you can call it WASP hegemony, or the period when Dinkst over at Yale and when Harvard's acceptance rate from Groton was about 99%. And that you feel ended somewhere in the 1920s. And then you describe what we could say was roughly from 1930 to 1980, which was meritocracy, or the opening to bringing in people who had not ever been part of that, certainly not part of the Ivy League spectrum, maybe part of the City College spectrum, but not the Ivy League spectrum. And then what you talk about is in shorthand, the Reagan era and the changes that the book are primarily about. One of the things that struck me was that that you and I both profited from the meritocracy, that we probably, in an earlier period, might not have been admitted to an Ivy League college. And yet, you know, the meritocracy comes off as one of the villains of your book. Could you both talk about that earlier period and suggest why it turned into something that was either different or less desirable than you felt before?
Yeah, I actually would periodize it a little differently, although I don't think we disagree. There was the old WASP aristocratic system with the feeder schools, Groton, you know, three rejected out of some 600 to Harvard in roughly the first third of the 20th century. That changed definitively, I mean, in the mid-60s. You know, Yale very suddenly threw out the old system and installed a new one. There was a period of transition from about the 30s to the 60s that I guess you came during, and then I came after the Great Change. So I really just see two periods. But I mean, there's a reason why I'm insisting on this. I see two periods: aristocracy and meritocracy, even if there's a transition between them. And there's a reason I insist on this. I think, however admirable clearly, however preferable clearly the meritocracy was as a system to the aristocracy, it seemed in retrospect to have contained the seeds of its own undoing. I don't think we still talk about ourselves as meritocracy. We still in theory have a meritocracy. It's just become what I call a hereditary meritocracy. The meritocracy has figured out how to perpetuate itself, and it's done that by evolving. It's done that by evolving a system of admissions It's the same system that I went through in the late 70s. It's just getting crazier and crazier. So when I went through high school, the kids who got into Ivy League schools had like 3 APs and 3 extracurriculars. I mean, you wouldn't even bother to apply if you were that kind of person now. Now you would need like 10 of each, or maybe 8 APs and 12 extracurriculars. It's just become this arms race. And the more you have to do, the more it costs parents to produce a child who can do that. I actually think that it's not a coincidence that it's not so much that Reaganism comes after the meritocracy. Reaganism substantially is coincidental with the meritocracy. The age of the meritocracy is the age of neoliberalism. That's what's so funny. So many meritocrats think of themselves, hey, I'm including all of us. I don't know you guys, but I mean, you and me and everybody we know, right? We're all liberals. We're all right-thinking. You know, we would never think to vote for a Republican. And yet, the logic of meritocracy, obviously I don't know all of you, the logic, but we're in Midtown. The logic of meritocracy is the same logic. It's the logic of every man for himself. And the meritocracy has succeeded in creating a world that's getting better and better for the meritocracy and worse for everybody else. And I don't think that's an accident.
Why do you center on the Ivy League? Some of the things that you describe are true of, well, it's different in public education, but some of the forces that you describe are present all through higher education, and yet, and of course, even in the Ivy League, there are many of the kinds of students that, I mean, I think you talk about much more favorably, for example, about public education. We appreciate that here. And also about the small liberal arts colleges. Aren't there many students who could have gone or would have gone to the small liberal arts colleges who are somewhere at Harvard or Yale and trying to get the same things out of those schools as they would get out of Amherst or Williams or some of the classic liberal arts schools?
Right, and some of them were my students. They tended to seek me out because they knew that they would find a sympathetic ear. I think the difference is that at the Ivy League schools and comparable schools, I mean, God knows, I don't think Duke is probably a lot worse. Washington University, Stanford has its own, the ones who sought me out at least, and then who wrote to me, felt embattled. They felt like freaks for wanting to pursue their intellectual curiosity rather than their professional advancement. And obviously this is a huge generalization. Liberal arts colleges cover many different kinds of institutions. Some of them I know firsthand are quite horrible, but many of them are wonderful. And I think that at many of those wonderful ones, those students, that kind of student doesn't feel embattled. That kind of student is closer to being the norm than the pre-professional.
And you don't feel that the pressure of the economy makes it more difficult today for people to major in English or the humanities? When I left graduate school, there was not a question of getting a teaching job teaching English. It was a question of which of your various offers you were going to choose. And the way that people got offers to teach in the university were that your mentor, your PhD advisor, would make 1 or 2 phone calls, and you were in. You had to decide, do you want to go to University of Wisconsin, or do you want to stay in the East, and so on and so forth. Now we didn't know at the time that we were living, at least employment-wise, we were living in a golden age when the university was expanding, and there was plenty of room for people, plenty of gainful employment for people who had cultivated the liberal arts. I would say that is not only more difficult today, but I think, as you point out in the book, it's particularly more difficult for children of immigrants or people from lower class backgrounds who, understandably, without any family money behind them, feel more of a pressure to study something vocationally more useful than to cultivate the self.
Well, there's several things to say about this, if I may. First of all, the two things are not mutually exclusive. I'm not even telling people to major in the humanities. I'm urging them to study humanities. They don't have to major in it. They certainly don't have to do their PhD in it, right? Second of all, and I have several pages on this in the book, there are a lot of studies a lot of people have talked about the vocational value of studying the liberal arts, what employers are actually looking for. There was a big study that was, there was a story about it in the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago based on the survey of over 300 employers, and the headline was, "Your college major is a minor issue," employers say. So there's a tremendous amount of misinformation and a tremendous dearth of good communication between the job market and students. They think they need to major in something practical. I don't think they have a robust enough understanding of what practical might mean, especially if you're already at a selective college, where you're mainly going to be employed based on the college you went to, how challenging your courses were, what your GPA was. That doesn't mean that these aren't issues. I recognize they're issues, and everyone has to judge for themselves, and family resources are absolutely going to play a role. But the last thing to say is, this did not start in 2008. This is a phenomenon that's been true for 40 years, and if you look, for example, at the graph of the percentage of people who major in English, you know, it was way high in the 60s, it's low now, but it was the lowest during the 80s, during the Reagan boom. This is about culture, this is about ideology.
But if you take the 40-year period, that would take us back to the economic problems of the early and mid-1970s, which are in many ways comparable to what we've had since 2008. In other words, if that was not the Great Recession, it was a Great Recession, though.
Okay, but the point is that, again, the meritocracy was put in place in the 60s, a huge boom time, and it has proceeded with its logic and its Reagan-esque logic in good times and bad. In the recession of the 70s, in the boom of the Reagan 80s, then there was a recession in the 90s, then Clinton came in, and it's just gone on and on and on. So I don't actually think this is about the underlying job market. I think this is about the way we understand ourselves and our goals. So, for example, I know people cite this statistic a lot, but you know, since the early 70s, UCLA, I think, has been doing a large-scale survey of college freshmen every year, and they ask them a lot of questions. And one question asks them to choose, I think what they want to get out of college, like their goal for college, and they can choose as many as they want to. And one line is developing a meaningful philosophy of life, which I don't love the phrase, but it's obviously a surrogate for this thing we're talking about. And one of the others is to become very well off. Not well off, but very well off. In the early 70s, which is when they started it, and you know the economy was beginning to fall off a cliff, about 80% chose the first and about 40% chose the second, and now the numbers are reversed. And the trend lines have been steady since then.
Well, maybe you can say a few words about the other issue, which bodes very large in the book in very interesting ways, which is this parental pressure. You know, you talk about over-identification. You make very interesting use of this book about the gifted child, Alice Miller's book, and so on. Why, I couldn't agree with you more. I see it all around me. Why are parents trying to prepare their pre-K students to apply to Harvard? What is, you know, I mean, I think they start building their resume at 3. It's absolutely true. Where is this coming from? You think it's not primarily economic pressure? What is it? Status anxiety? Is it desire?
Status anxiety, status competition, parents, you know, over-involvement of the parent with the child, over-identification with the child, basically. You know, listen, also, we're now in the second generation, right? So the parents themselves went through the system, so they're still grading themselves on everything. And the grade they give themselves for parenting is the window sticker, right? That's their final exam for being a parent. I think it's a terrible way of looking at parenting. If you want to have a final exam, I would say the final exam should be, have you raised an autonomous person who's capable of making choices even in defiance of you? I don't think a lot of people see it that way.
Well, I should mention that Bill in his book talks about, a very interesting passage, talks about the need for kids to rebel against their parents rather than to replicate their parents. I don't know whether it's true that many parents want their kids to replicate themselves, but I'm sure it's certainly a factor. But you talk really about the need to put aside your parents' values, and you quote Mark Edmondson saying, it's understandable that they would begin to identify more with their teachers rather than with their parents, because their parents are where they came from, but their teachers represent where they want to be going, or the values that they have picked up in college, and but it does relate in an interesting way to this whole issue of helicopter parenting and parents hovering over their children. I think it's also connected to the difference between my generation's relation to our parents and my kids' generation. My wife once said, "Do you think that our kids are going to rebel against us in the way that we rebelled against our parents?" And I said, "Yeah, of course they have to be in order to be autonomous, except that they'll be wrong." I mean, the truth is, my parents came here as young children, but they were essentially had an immigrant mentality. The gap between my generation and their generation was pretty wide. I think fundamentally the gap, if you go a couple of generations further down, the gap between the parental and the student generation is less. And so the idea, I think parents understand more what their kids are facing and what they'll be doing. Whether they should be working so hard to build up brownie points for the kids is another matter, and that could be the residue of that book that I mentioned earlier, The Culture of Narcissism. It's a narcissistic thing to want your kids to fulfill yourself in ways that would shed a favorable light on yourself. So, I mean, this.
Yeah, I mean, I understand what you say when you say that the generation gap is smaller than between our immigrant parents and us, but I think if there's a very small generation gap now, it's not because it's because there's this terrible collusion between parents and children now to not create one. I mean, generational conflict wasn't invented by the 60s. I think the anthropologists will tell you that it's part of it's a regular feature of human society. And
that is about the making of a self.
It's about the making of the self. And I think, listen, I think you guys, many of you, most of you probably all know as well as we do that I think that many kids now are having a lot of problem with self-formation. We all know about how many kids are living at home now, but that trend towards kids living at home also did not start with the financial collapse. It's gotten worse. It was already a very pronounced phenomenon beforehand. Because, we're all friends now. There's no need to have generational conflict because we understand each other. Adolescent psychologists who I quote in the book, who work especially with high-achieving, affluent kids who have an epidemic of mental illness, right? They have some of the highest levels of depression, anxiety, everything, of any kids. The smartest, most high-achieving kids have this. And the thing that's most striking is that of all kids in the country, including the poorest ones, they feel most disconnected from their parents, from the helicopter parents, because the helicopter parents are hovering and they're superintending and they're supervising. But that doesn't mean that there's any communication going in the other direction. And time after time, I mean, it's heartbreaking. Parents will write to me and say, I didn't know what was going on with my kid until they had a breakdown sophomore year, until they had a breakdown 2 years after college. What do I do with them now? They don't know how to be autonomous.
Turn to the whole question, the whole misnomer about the book, don't send your kids to the Ivy League. Why is that not an accurate summary of your book?
First of all, because I'm not just talking about the Ivy League. If the Ivy League is a shorthand for selective colleges or selective universities, that gets a little bit better. But also, it's not, first of all, I wouldn't say, people say, where should I send my kid? And I say, you shouldn't send them anywhere, right? You should help them figure out where they should go. But the real problem to me, I mean, the biggest problem to me that the colleges are responsible for is actually the admissions process. So it's not about whether you actually go to Harvard by the time you get to be 17 and you're deciding where to go. The problem is you've become the kind of person who can get in there, which is to say you've become an excellent sheep. It's a phrase that came from one of my students. These kids are like the best students in history. They're the best at being students. They're the best at knowing figuring out what the teacher wants and giving it to them with the minimum effort, so they can also devote the minimum effort to their clubs and their sports teams and their musical instruments and do it all at once, because that's the only way it gets done, right, with the minimum.
Well,
But they're sheep, right? They don't know how to self-direct.
well, they're probably, even among the elite schools, there's probably a lot of difference. I mean, you and I both went to Columbia, and at least my poop on Harvard was, well, it's notorious that kids can get through Harvard for 4 years without having a single conversation with a faculty member. And it's also notorious that, or the saving thing, if you want to call it that their education comes from each other rather than from the faculty. Columbia prided itself on introducing the freshmen to the core curriculum in small sections. Most other universities have introductory courses that are large lecture courses. That really makes for quite a different experience. But if the students get their education at a school like Harvard largely from each other, that means that there are a lot of kids there who have got to be really interesting to each other. They're not just networking at that age.
Don't you know, listen, I mean, I'll get to the larger point in a second. Freeman Dyson, the great physicist, told a story about his daughter, and his daughter's I think she's my age or older. I mean, she went to Harvard College probably 50 years ago at this point. I don't know how long, a long time ago. And he was berating her for not taking her courses seriously. And she said, "Daddy, don't you know that we don't go to Harvard for those courses? We go to Harvard to meet each other." I think networking is what it's all about. And I think that's one of the reasons extracurriculars are so important. And a lot of people have testified, including the Times columnist Ross Douthat, who wrote a memoir of his Harvard years called Privilege. Came out 2001, I think, or he graduated in 2001, 2002. And he said what other people have said, that they don't have time for the late night bull sessions. Yes, their college experience is shaped by each other, but that doesn't mean they're learning from each other. I kind of think and of course there are exceptions, but the whole emphasis on learning, it's not about learning, it's about becoming credentialed. There are differences among the schools. I don't think they're huge differences, mainly because the way the kids prepare to get to one of these schools is the same. And one of the many baleful effects of U.S. news is that, in fact, it's leading to a homogenization of higher ed. I think the saddest case is the University of Chicago, which may still be, it's always had the reputation as being the most intellectual, the most academically serious of the colleges at universities, right? They prided themselves on, they don't have a life because they're in the library. And the admissions process was part of that. They had what they called the uncommon app, right, rather than the common app. And the admissions office would spend a lot of ingenuity thinking up these really sort of intense intellectual questions that you would have to, take a swing at for the application. As of a few years ago, they were ranked 10th in U.S. News, and their admissions rate was in the 20s. So, a lot higher than comparable institutions, but they were still ranked 10th. And for some reason, they decided that wasn't good enough. So they threw out the Uncommon app. Their admissions rate has plummeted to the high single digits. They're now 5th. But I'm afraid that in a few years, they won't be the University of Chicago anymore. So I think these differences, there are differences around the edges. Harvard, you never get to see a professor. Columbia, you take the core curriculum, mostly taught by graduate students at this point, or non-professors. Right. But substantially the same wherever you go.
Well, maybe you can talk a little bit about the teaching, which is an important part of your book. You feel that due to the primacy of the research university, that good teaching is not only not valued, but it's actively discouraged. Why don't you talk a bit about that?
And of course, this is not 50 years. This is like 100 years. This is, people were talking about this a century
Since the
ago.
creation of the research university,
Since the creation of the research university, the incentives for faculty members, I mean, I hope everybody knows this, right? It's actually been said, winning the teaching award is the kiss of death when it comes to tenure time. Because it means that you're spending too much time on your teaching, so your research program is going to suffer. Good teaching takes time. Sometimes people end up being good teachers anyway. They're gifted or they can do it all. Unfortunately, I think students don't appreciate this. I think often students don't even know if their teacher's a professor or not and don't even understand the distinction. If things are going to change, in whatever direction they're going to change, I think the impetus has to come from students and parents. In other words, from the people that the colleges think of as customers. And I would like students, if I could tell students what they should agitate about, I would like them to agitate about who's teaching their classes. So we can reclaim teaching as an equal part of the mission.
Well, in this university, of course, we teach only graduate students, and one of the things that our graduates actually gives our students a leg up in the job market is the fact that this is a very large university with many branches and an enormous desire and need for what you call contingent labor for graduate student and adjunct teaching. And so when they come onto the job market, they actually have a good deal more teaching experience than students in most schools. That teaching experience is not necessarily under the best conditions or with the best payment, though it actually is better than many other places as far as adjunct teaching goes. But one thing that they do experience is this dissonance between the stuff that they're working on themselves in their dissertations and the stuff that they have to teach, which is often very much less professional and more introductory and so on. So that, I mean, that speaks to the dissonance between research and teaching. On the other hand, there's a counter-argument that the best teachers are not necessarily the ones that spend the most time on it, but that people who are working at the cutting edge of their field, and that they are at the heart of whatever the debates and issues and so on are in their field. I mean, a case can be made for that, for those people who indeed are at the cutting edge, rather than those people who are doing relatively pedestrian work.
Is that case based on evidence or just on an argument? Because I don't know that...
I guess that's the classic explanation.
That's the explanation.
Yeah.
I don't know that experience bears it out. Certainly, I've heard many times that one of the reasons people drop out of science majors is because the teaching is just so damn lousy. I think English professors tend to be good teachers partly because the discipline in some ways is more consonant with the skills of good teaching. The best teachers at Yale when I was on the faculty were not professors. What I think everybody knows about adjuncts. What even I didn't know until recently is that, well, first of all, by the way, 25% of people who teach at American universities now are professors, or I should say only 25%. A lot of the others are adjuncts, but a third of the total are what they call full-time non-tenure track. And maybe some of you are that, or you know people like that. They have full-time employment under whatever rubric, but they're not in the professorial ladder. Those are the people who are the best teachers at Yale. They were often very experienced, but they have no status. They probably don't get paid very well. They are, I mean, it's essentially what I'm saying is that at least at Yale and probably at other places, they had evolved what I would like to see, which is a parallel teaching faculty, right? People who are valued and rewarded and promoted because of their teaching, but actually an actual faculty, with equal status to the research faculty. I think Columbia used to have that, right? The Columbia College faculty back in your day, but that ceased to exist.
It was dissolved about 20 years ago,
Yeah.
right? Well, I think maybe we should open the discussion to audience comments and questions. We have microphones on either side. So if you have, either of us.
Go ahead. Stand up. I think they're gonna. Oh yeah, go to a microphone, or I guess you could line. I don't know if you want to line up at the microphone. I think they want you to go to the microphone.
Yeah.
I found the UCLA statistic that you mentioned in the beginning of your talk to be really interesting, and I'm curious what you think of the like mass explosion and proliferation of like yoga and mindfulness, and just like a general sense of spirituality that has like seeped into the tech world and a lot of the business world, and how you see that juxtaposition with like this general trend towards like you mentioned, not looking for that bigger picture.
That's very
morality
interesting.
Or whatever.
I rarely get a new question at this point, and no. I mean, I don't say that to make fun of the question. I think that's great. And off the cuff, this is what I would say, and it connects to another thing that I have only realized recently in responding to the responses, because people say, why do you blame the colleges? This is a societal thing. And I say, yeah, there are many actors and they all have their role, but colleges are one of them, and they have their role, even if they're pushing against larger societal forces of the kind that I've been talking about. We have always been a commercial civilization. I think Lionel Trilling's phrase was a business civilization. We always will be. But we have always, or at least frequently, had some set of counterbalancing institutions or ideas, whether it's the Emersonian literary tradition or the churches or the colleges. And when those have withered away, like say maybe in the Gilded Age, they've had to be re-articulated and resurrected with effort. So colleges, I think, traditionally have been countercultural institutions, and they have largely surrendered that role. It never occurred to me until your question that one of the things that's taken their place is whatever, yoga, mindfulness, Eastern. I mean, I live in Portland. I do that stuff too. These are human needs. They are real things. They're gonna be expressed. I think it's great that that body of stuff is around, even if I think some of it is silly, but I take a lot of it very seriously. It's kind of it's quite a statement to say that the job that Harvard should be doing is now being done by the yoga studios. I would say that.
Some 60-odd years ago, there was a book written and published by a man called Eric Hoffer. I don't know if that's a name that has any resonance for people in the audience, but it was...
The True Believer.
The True Believer. Thank you, Morris. And this was a longshoreman, a laborer, who never went to college. I'm not sure if it was a bestseller or not, but it was a book that struck me as very profound and dealt with many of the issues that you're talking about today. And I wonder if his name is surfaced in any of the courses that you guys teach. Are you familiar with the book?
I haven't heard that.
I highly recommend it. I'm sure you know it, Morris.
Daniel, I haven't heard that name in about 20 or 30 years.
I know.
But my recollection of the book is that the True Believer, wasn't it a rather negative kind? Wasn't the True Believer a kind of a fanatic?
No, but he wrote against people who were subjecting themselves to all forms of isms, whether it's communism or whatever. It was a very intellectual work, as I remember it.
But I recall it as a kind of Cold War book against ideology. It's a kind of end of ideology book. I remember a number of books that were published during that period. There was another one more scholarly than that on the same point by an English writer named Norman Cohen called The Pursuit of the Millennium, and it was all about the dangers of getting ideologically and fanatically committed to causes as opposed to what was much more valued in the 50s, which was pragmatism and compromise and getting along and going along and so on. It wasn't, I may be misremembering it, but I suspect that my recollection is that Hoffer was one of these anti-ideology books.
Well, it was. He was oddball. There's no question about that.
I mean, the odd thing about it was, as you say, that it was written by a longshoreman and not by a scholar at
That's
the
right.
University of London.
It's the other end of the spectrum. You're talking about parents who are going crazy with having to get their kids go to Harvard and the things that you have been describing. And here is a guy with no formal education whatsoever who wrote a deeply philosophical work. I have to reread it. Maybe I'm a little off the wall on it.
I think my way of relating to what you're saying is that people at the elite institutions and the people in the Ivy League don't seem to understand that you can be smart and intellectual and not go to one of their schools.
That's true.
That's the remarkable thing.
Okay.
Over here.
Hello, hi. My name is Danny. I grew up poor in East New York, Brooklyn. I went to Skidmore College, and I majored in American Studies, so I really know the whole value of liberal arts and the small liberal arts college. And in your book, you didn't really talk much about the plight of low-income students from high school to the kind of schools that you talk about. These kind of students are taught to the test, from the point that they start school, have people in their high school who promote the kinds of schools that you talk against, or public schools like CUNY where they miss out on half of the point of college, which is the experience outside of the classroom, because most students are commuter students. Then when these students are asked to seek help, think for themselves and think critically, they freeze up. And I've seen this, working with students doing college counseling in the high school right now, because they haven't been nurtured in that way, which is why they struggle in college. And there's a lot of articles talking about low-income students struggling in college. What I want to ask you is, how do you propose students, these kind of students that, I serve, be prepared to engage college the way that they're supposed to, especially when colleges, considering even Skidmore, moving away from requiring liberal arts classes, which is something they started to do when I entered in 2005. And sort of as a side question, you talked about gap year programs a little bit, and do you think that gap year would be helpful for these kind of students? And if so, how so? And how do you propose to them that how do you propose these kind of options to them when they feel a sense of urgency to go right to college because of their peers, family, and school staff?
Right. The honest answer is, I wrote about what I know, and that's not really those students. I'm not sure that I would necessarily urge a gap year on those students, because I'm not sure they need him. I think gap years are for kids who have some growing up and some independence to acquire, and I'm not sure that kind of student needs that. I just want to be clear. I say a gap year, I don't say a gap year program. In fact, I say, don't keep building the resume by doing a program. But there is a larger thing to say, and I think in some sense the implicit compliment to the privileged kids that I talk about is what the system does, and sort of the hidden thing that I don't talk about, but it's part of it, is what the system that's been created for the privileged kids has done to every other kid. I talk about it a little in the end, because my biggest solution, as utopian as this may be, is for us to resurrect, through the serious commitment of tax dollars on the part of the top 10%, resurrect free, high-quality public higher education. I just found out tonight that CUNY was free. And CUNY was free until the 70s. I didn't know that. The California system was free until the early 80s. But that also won't do any good until we also equalize funding K through 12. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that huge amounts of resources, educational resources, have been diverted from the bottom 90% to the top 10%, just as huge amounts of resources in general have been diverted from the bottom 90% to the top 10%. And we need to gather the political will to divert them back. So the kinds of kids you're talking about are going to good grade schools and high schools and have the opportunity to go to a great college that's free, that's public. That doesn't that doesn't address any of the problems that the kids you're working with have now. But I'm not really equipped to do that because I just don't know that world. So I hope that was
Could I
helpful.
ask you a question? I mean, you talked about the students that you're working with. What about your own college experience? Did anything in Bill's book connect to your college experience at Skidmore?
You know, at the time, right now, when I read the book, I'm sort of writing my second book now about my life story, and a lot of it influenced a lot of what I said. Talked about my education of what I read in your book really influenced and made me reflect upon my experience at Skidmore because a lot of the students, you know, a lot of my peers who grew up poor as well and went to Skidmore. You know, we're just only looking forward to graduating, and that's it. You know, not really trying to engage on campus and do these, you know, social things. I remember going to the Black Club, the Hispanic Club, and how they weren't really about education and educating one another in conversations. They were all about sort of more of the high-intensity social aspect of college and sticking together kind of thing. And I think for me, what the book did for me was made me realize just like how much I really took control of my education at Skidmore. And in terms of, you know, when I talk about my major in American Studies to my students or anyone who really asks, is I took classes, particularly with the liberal arts, you know, requirements, classes that appealed to me, you know, and that made me learn more about myself and learn more about other cultures here in America. And I've always been interested in American history and American culture. And and I see how that really helps me now in the kind of work that I do with the different kind of populations that I deal with that aren't really relating to, you know, who I am as a person. And I took what I learned inside the classroom and also really applied that to a lot outside of the classroom and founded a club where we talked about things like the N-word, sexism, and homophobia, and how powerful those conversations were. And it wasn't just students that were there; it was administrators and faculty there as well, engaging in the conversations.
Can I just say that this is why you're an example of why it pisses me off so much when people say, hey, what you're talking about is fine for the rich kids, but the poor kids, they need to study something practical. And what they're really saying is that cultural capital or cultural knowledge is you know, we're going to reserve it for us.
Yeah.
Right? That's the real elitist position.
And you know, the thing is, too, is when I gone through a lot of emotions. I wanted to be so many different things. I wanted to be a video game programmer, and at one point, I was majoring. I thought I was going to major in acting, and I took a couple of acting classes, and it helped me with my speaking so much. And I always tell my students who struggle with speaking, take acting classes when you get to college, because it will help you tremendously. And when I finally arrived to American Studies, certain people, particularly in my family, weren't particularly happy with my decision, and didn't quite understand. And then, you know, and I went through, you know, all these different majors in terms of kind of maybe a little bit trying to appease some of those people. But when I finally arrived at American Studies and took those kind of classes that I took, that's when I truly just let go of what everybody thought about me and what I did, you know?
Could I ask you a question? You don't have to answer this, but did you get, what kind of financial support did you get to go to Skidmore? Did you get a decent scholarship?
I was a part of, one of the great things about, you know, New York State students, being from New York State and being of low income, is that this is a program called Higher Education Opportunity Program, HEOP. And before you actually start in the fall, you are in the summer program, learning how to write, trying to get a math requirement out of the way, taking a liberal arts class. And some of the kids had a gripe with that. And in reading your book and writing my book at the same time, I realized how I'm glad that they made me take that liberal arts class, you know? So and being a part of HEOP, the state requires them, in terms of writing grants and stuff like that, to give those low-income students good financial deals, which range from $8,000 to $12,000 in loans after 4 years. And but you know, a lot of the people, it was always a hot debate where I was going to go to school. My father really wanted me to stay here in New York City, and I knew, you know, CUNY is great and has a lot of great resources, but I knew if I would have stayed here in New York City and been a commuter student, I wouldn't have graduated because of the things I was dealing with at home. So,
The reason that I
Yeah,
asked you,
yeah.
the reason that I asked you is because it's an odd twist, but because some of the Ivy League schools like Harvard are so rich that poor kids who do get into Harvard are likely to get much fuller financial support than they might be at colleges that might in some way be more suited or more satisfying to them. I don't know how many how many people have profited from how many poor kids have profited from the wealth of very wealthy schools like Harvard, they're likely to get more financial support from Harvard than they are from CUNY.
well,
If they can get in.
And I think Skidmore does pretty
on.
good with financial aid, That's
So, just in the interest of,
Thanks, Danny. We're looking forward to your book.
Sorry.
When I look back at high school, let's say 10th, 11th, and 12th, there are two things that really stick in my head. One is that there was more privacy in life. People weren't as into each other's business, and there were no cell phones and we just didn't have the technology to be on top of each other or for our parents to be on top of us. The other is, I think people were more modest. I don't remember, and for full disclosure, I knew Bill at that time. I don't remember ever knowing or caring when anyone was getting on any test or where they were applying to college and where they were going. We didn't care. So I don't know what's happened, and I don't know how much technology and certainly social media plays into it. But if I look on my Facebook, I see people posting when the admissions decisions come out where their kids got into school and what their 4-year-old did at their birthday party and things that most people don't care about. Why are they doing this? And is this a part of all of what you're talking about somehow?
I wasn't aware of this, doesn't surprise me. It sounds like social media has once again exacerbated trends that were already in progress. I mean, we didn't need to wait for Facebook for suburban parents to compete with each other for where their kids get into college. Why that's maybe more true than it was 40 years ago, if that's how you perceive it, I'm not sure. There may be deeper sociological reasons that have to do with the fact that we don't have other forms of community. We don't have other forms of status. Like, this has become the form of status, like where you went to college.
Thanks, Bill.
Hello. First, if I speak too long, stop me. That's my request. I like the title of your book, but I wonder why it is written about colleges and not workplace. I think it's a chicken and egg problem, and maybe colleges are not the root of the problem. I think the problem more resides with workplace. And if students graduate, they walk into rat race. And that's not something that inspires to look for high inspirations, pursue your intellectual interests. Intellectual interest and high inspiration give food for thought, but not fill your stomach. And I think that's the root of the problem. So don't you think that the problem of excellenceship originates in workplace, not in colleges, and it should be fixed on the other end?
I think that workplaces play a role in this. Again, it wasn't the thing that I was equipped to talk about. A lot of employers in graduate schools will only look at you if you come from a certain set of colleges, and so it reinforces the same increasingly steep status hierarchy. But again, I say, because what I really hear in your question is, it's all well and good to talk about the soul or whatever, but you need to get a job, and we have this terrible economy now. And I will say again, this is not something that started 6 years ago. It started 40, 50 years ago as a new ideology was put in place where the public was denigrated, public goods were denigrated, higher aspirations were denigrated. People were told, I mean, in many ways, this was sort of overt programmatic propaganda, where we were told again and again and again that what matters is how much money you make and how you can display your wealth to other people. That's not about how many jobs are out there. It's been true when the unemployment rate is very low and the country is, is riding this various bubbles of prosperity that we have had. So I don't see this as a problem that originates in the workplace, although I certainly think that that's, again, a part of it.
Just to conclude, maybe one sentence, that I see people who try to pursue careers related to English major, etc., and they are struggling, and that's what I see. But I conclude. Thank you for your answer.
This is not fair, but I just want to say one thing because, no, you can, but because I want people to know this, I think this puts this in a different light. The number of people majoring in the basic sciences, the physical sciences, physics, chemistry, and geology and stuff, that's dropped more than the number of people majoring in the humanities. And almost nobody majors in pure math anymore. They major in applied math. We talk about STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, but we're not interested in science or we're not interested in math. We're interested in technology and engineering, which means we're interested in technology. We're interested in applied science. And everything else has been suffering. So engineering, computer science, econ, that's what students are being herded towards. This is not about studying poetry or not studying poetry.
I want to push back on your answer to the excellent question before about yoga and wellness and mindfulness. As I'm a twice weekly yoga practitioner, it's not where I go to learn about things outside of myself that are bigger than myself. In fact, yoga studios in DC are pushing back on their obligation to pay taxes, right, under their business classification. So I think it actually would be, I think it's more useful to think about that as another form of, you wrote about how service, this notion of service and this notion of like community has become marginalized in favor of something that's more entrepreneurial or something that's more sort of that has a greater ego cachet, right, in terms of how we contribute to the world or how we serve the world. And I think to say that our yearning for meaning or our yearning for community is being somehow, I don't think you meant successfully, but that it's somehow being satisfactorily met by this drive towards yoga, meditation, mindfulness, what have you. First of all, that certainly serves its own ultimate bottom line purpose within a business context. But more importantly, it's the same thing. It's all the flavor, none of the fat, or whatever the reverse. It's maybe the reverse. I don't know. But like it's that same sense of the facsimile, right, of caring or of participating without actually making any difficult choices or sacrifices or discernment about what's important in the larger world versus what makes you feel good about yourself. That's a statement. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, listen, yoga can be done in many different spirits. As I understand it in New York, it's just sort of another form of exercise. Out in Portland, I think it may be a little different.
It's a religion.
But no, yeah, I mean, yeah, right. I actually say we have more yoga studios than we have churches in Portland. I mean,
but yoga.
But I think the real issue, and this actually points to a gap in my argument that I have struggled with and continue to struggle with, because I talk about, building a self and developing some kind of inner space and resilience, and then the chapter ends and you turn the page and then there's a chapter about leadership, which is my way of talking about, by attacking the concept of leadership as it now exists, talking about this larger social giving back thing. And I recognize that, you can discover what you feel to be your purpose in the world, and it might lead you to be a derivatives trader. So there isn't necessarily a connection between those two things. And I don't necessarily have a satisfactory answer for that, except to say that I think what really generally tends to give people fulfillment has something to do with connecting them to something larger and not simply, making a lot of money for themselves. But
I mean, I would say that the vogue of yoga, meditation, mindfulness, Buddhist notions of being in the moment are closely related to just the kind of achievement pressures and social pressures and success pressures that Bill is talking about in his book. It's exactly, this is the relief that other people get through tranquilizers that they, I've done meditation myself for exactly that reason.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk and for stimulating this discussion. I feel like this is a topic that I'm very passionate about. I spent 6 years doing doctoral work at the University of Pennsylvania and Princeton, and sociology and demography. And I find that there's this underlying begging question that we're in the midst as a country and as a society in an ideological war that's some ways, a red state, blue state fighting, and we're not. We're very polarized, and that the Ivy League represents a certain unity or homogenization of thinking that is extremely secular in parts. I mean, I know one professor who was Christian in my entire graduate experience, and of course the university presidents at Ivy League schools today are predominantly Jewish, and there's a certain ideological clash as a history in the United States where we've been historically a Christian country, and that's been taken outside and no longer allowed in intellectual space in the Ivy League. And I was wondering if you could comment on the role of religion and the clash between Judaism and Christianity.
I don't think I'm going to comment on the clash between Judaism and Christianity. I will comment on the clash between the idea of the university and religion. There's actually a book called Why Are Professors So Liberal and Why Do Conservatives Care? I think it's roughly the title. It came out recently. And he talks about there are reasons why professors tend to be liberal, and it has to do, he talks about the history of higher education in the 19th century when the new research universities especially, which had a new, now they weren't church institutions, now they were creating knowledge, and they were creating knowledge in a value-neutral way that involved, in many ways, challenging religion and religious premises, and there was a big, kind of a big fight between the churches and the universities. Listen, universities are by their nature secular places in the sense that they don't subscribe to specific religious ideologies. There may also be a problem that religious people feel marginalized at those institutions. I don't think it's Christians are marginalized because all these evil Jews are making them feel that way. Okay. That may be true, but I think that may be true. I haven't thought about this enough to give you an intelligent answer, so I want to say something else, which is I don't, I mean, something that's related and has to do with red state versus blue state. I mean, I hope it's clear if you read the book that I am attacking the liberal upper middle class. I am attacking the class that I belong to, which is incredibly satisfied with itself, believes that it has a right to its position, believes that it's in possession of the moral high ground. And the red state, blue state divide is an articulation of that from their side. The red state also thinks they're morally superior. Unfortunately, conservatism has gotten to the point where it's embedded the beliefs of liberals that they are morally superior, because conservatism is making itself look very bad. And I'm trying to say, hey, liberal upper middle class meritocrats, you may be very satisfied with your own opinions about identity politics or whatever, but you are as much a part of this system that perpetuates privilege as anyone else. And when the rubber really meets the road, what you really care about is making sure that your kids are standing first in line.
Thank you. I'm currently parenting twin 13-year-olds, and I would love some reassurance if it's available. I spend most of my days almost sitting on my hands because I would love for them to be happy people and to find their passions. But I myself figured out how to game the system, and I know that if they are ultimately interested in attending some of these more alternative, small, more appropriate colleges, that they can't have a blank resume. We don't push them at all, and there are a number of parents on the Upper West Side, and I'm sure elsewhere, that don't push their kids, but you're aware of all the ones who are. And I have no interest in them going to any of these Ivy League schools. I know that they're not a fit. But I'm just wondering if the more unique opportunities out there are available to kids who aren't playing instruments and learning languages and who are just being themselves and being bright and interesting and authentic, or is that unrealistic? Do they need to do a little resume building? Or, I mean, should I keep sitting on my hands and I
think my only honest answer is that I don't know, and I probably should know. My guess is that they will probably be fine because they will want to do some things, and so they will end up having a resume. And I hear about kids who, you know, and then and they don't go to the Ivy League and they go somewhere else and they're like interesting. And I'm not going to tell you that your kids are going to be fine. I mean, I don't know you or your kids. But if I had to guess, I think they will be.
They'll be fine as people. They might just not attend a college that is consistent with what you're articulating.
The reason I called that essay "The Disadvantages" is because everybody knows the advantages, and they are real. You know, if you want to maximize status and wealth, go to the Ivy League. I just wanted people to understand that there are always going to be trade-offs. It's not as if you aren't making a trade-off by pushing your kid to the Ivy League. You're giving something up there too, and maybe something that's more important. But I'm very clear, I repeat this over and over in the book, you will probably have to give something up for finding your own, you know, in order to find your own way. You're going to give up some status and wealth, and that's not easy. That's not easy.
Thank you.
Well, I think we have to stop here. I want to thank Bill for presenting his book. All right. Well, I'm told that we have time for one more question. Go right ahead.
I was sitting there and trying to understand how complicated the problem is, and I wasn't sure I could actually ask a question because I saw so many contradictions until the gentleman got up and talked about work. And I realized that there is a larger problem where it's both work and education and all those things. But I'm thinking that, you know, you might be right to a certain extent, but I think the problem is, I'm wondering if the problem is not a lack of moderation, because what you call status might not be completely status. It might be that people need a better sense of security in difficult times, even though you kind of dismiss that relatively, but we do live in times of rapid change, you know, a lot of things are happening, and so, but that's just one aspect of what I want to bring up. I mean, let's talk about the issue of having electives in the American system. There is a lack of moderation there also, because, you know, maybe kids need some kind of direction and some kind of mandatory classes, you know, and maybe there is a lack of flexibility, okay? And also there is the phenomenon of kids going after grades. They're in school just to get grades. You know what I'm saying? And you kind of brought that up. And also, you know, it's a bunch of contradictions. So I'm thinking there's a lack of moderation in the system, you know, a lack of balance. And maybe the biggest problems nowadays are extremism, over specialization, over focus, and also a lot of irrationalities.
You're raising a lot of issues, and we're not only almost out of time, we're already out of time. Let me just say quickly that I actually think that even in the most practical terms, both for individuals and for society, this kind of hoop-jumping, credential-seeking, risk-averse elite education is actually very self-defeating. This sort of SAT-driven system was evolved at a time when the economy was governed by large bureaucratic organizations, the Ford Motor Company, the Ford Foundation, the Defense Department. Basically, the idea was intelligence test everybody, slot them into the bureaucracy. We had a relatively static system. The Cold War was also a static system. It made a certain sense. Now we're creating kids. David Brooks has said this too. We're preparing kids for a very unstructured work environment with a very structured education. That is a tremendous disservice, even in pure terms of how much money you're going to make. And the fact is that our East Asian competitors, whom we're always comparing ourselves to, they're trying to figure out how they can be more like us. Because they see that, well, that they have very high test scores, blah, 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 but the innovations are still coming from the United States. They are trying to introduce more liberal arts into their systems. So what I'm talking about may have to do with the soul and the self and all that stuff, but it is also extremely practical, and I really wish people understood that.